After months of living in fear of my husband's obsessed ex, we finally escaped her clutches. Now we're rebuilding our lives and learning to live without fear again. When Jake and I first moved into our cozy suburban home, we felt like we were starting a new chapter of our lives. We had just celebrated our second wedding anniversary, and everything seemed to be falling into place. Our days were filled with simple joys, cooking dinner together, planning weekend getaways, and dreaming about our future. It was the kind of peaceful life I had always hoped for, and I felt incredibly lucky to share it with him. But that peace was shattered the day Claire reappeared. Claire was Jake's ex-girlfriend, someone he had dated years before we met. She was just a name in his past, a part of his life that he had left behind long ago. Or so I thought. When Jake and I started dating, he had mentioned Claire a few times, mostly in passing. He described their relationship as brief and intense, but ultimately unsustainable. They had ended things on what he believed were mutual terms, and he hadn't heard from her in years. So when Claire suddenly showed up at our favorite coffee shop one Saturday morning, I didn't think much of it at first. Jake and I were sitting by the window, enjoying our lattes and planning our weekend, when she walked in. I noticed her immediately, tall, striking, with long dark hair and an air of confidence that drew attention. She looked around the cafe, and when her eyes landed on Jake, her face lit up with a wide smile. "Jake," she called out, her voice bright with surprise. "Oh my God, is that really you?" Jake looked up, and the moment he saw her, his expression froze. "Claire," he replied, clearly caught off guard. "Wow, I didn't expect to see you here." Claire walked over to our table, her eyes never leaving Jake. "I just moved back to town," she explained, her smile widening. "It's been so long." "How have you been?" Jake hesitated for a moment before responding. "I've been good." "This is my wife," he said, gesturing to me with a slightly awkward smile. "Claire, this is Emma." Claire finally turned to me, her smile polite but distant. "Nice to meet you, Emma." "I've heard a lot about you." "Nice to meet you too," I replied, trying to keep my tone friendly. But something about the way she was looking at Jake made me feel uneasy. For the next few minutes, Claire and Jake exchanged small talk. She asked about his job, how he liked living in the area, and whether he still went to their old haunts. Jake answered her questions politely, but I could tell he was uncomfortable. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but I brushed it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Claire glanced at her watch and said, "I'd love to catch up more, but I've got to run." "Maybe we can grab coffee sometime," Jake nodded, though I could see the hesitation in his eyes. "Yeah, sure. Take care, Claire." As she walked away, I turned to Jake, raising an eyebrow. That was unexpected. Jake let out a breath he had been holding. "Yeah, I wasn't expecting to see her." "I haven't heard from her in years. Do you think she's trying to reconnect?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. "I don't know," Jake admitted. "We didn't end things on bad terms, but I thought we had both moved on." "I'm happy with you, Emma." "She's just an ex," I nodded, trying to shake off the unease. But something about the encounter didn't sit right with me. Claire's attention had been so focused on Jake, almost as if I hadn't even been there. And that smile, there was something behind it that felt off. In the days that followed, I tried to push the incident out of my mind. Jake and I continued with our usual routine, and for a while, things felt normal again. But then, Claire started showing up more frequently. It began with seemingly innocent encounters. She'd bump into us at the grocery store, or we'd spot her at the park where we often took our evening walks. Each time, she'd greet Jake with that same wide smile, acting as if they were old friends who had simply lost touch. At first, I told myself it was just a coincidence. After all, she had just moved back to town. But as the encounters became more frequent, I started to wonder if they were really accidental. Then the messages began. Jake started receiving texts from an unknown number. The first one was simple. "Hey, it's Claire. Great seeing you the other day. Hope you're doing well." Jake showed it to me, shrugging it off as nothing more than a friendly check-in. But I could see the discomfort in his eyes. Claire hadn't asked for his number, and yet she had somehow gotten it. Over the next few days, the messages kept coming. They were mostly casual, Claire asking how Jake was doing, mentioning things that reminded her of their time together, and suggesting they meet up for coffee. Jake didn't respond to most of them, hoping she would take the hint and back off. But instead of stopping, the messages became more frequent, more personal. Remember that time we went to that little Italian place downtown? I walked by it today and couldn't help but think of you, one message read. Another said, I miss our talks. We should catch up properly soon. Jake's discomfort grew, and so did mine. It was clear that Claire wasn't just being friendly, she was trying to reinsert herself into his life. One evening, after yet another message from Claire had appeared on Jake's phone, I finally voiced my concern. Jake, don't you think this is getting a little out of hand? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She's clearly not getting the message, Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, I think you're right. I'll talk to her. I need to make it clear that I'm happily married, and that she needs to move on. The next day, Jake sent Claire a firm but polite message, telling her that while it had been nice to catch up, he didn't think it was appropriate for them to stay in contact. He emphasized that he was committed to me and that their relationship was in the past. I felt a wave of relief when he showed me the message, hoping it would finally put an end to Claire's unwanted attention, but it didn't. Instead of backing off, Claire's behavior escalated. The messages continued, but now they were filled with a strange mix of nostalgia and desperation. She talked about how much she missed Jake, how she believed they had something special that couldn't be replaced. Her words were filled with longing, as if she was trying to convince Jake that he had made a mistake by moving on. Jake stopped responding altogether, hoping that Claire would eventually give up. But she didn't seem to care that her messages were going unanswered. In fact, it seemed to fuel her obsession even more. Then, one evening, there was a knock at our door. We were in the middle of dinner, enjoying a quiet night at home, when the sound startled us both. I glanced at Jake, who looked just as surprised as I felt. We weren't expecting anyone, and it was late for a neighborly visit. Jake got up to answer the door, and when he opened it, there stood Claire, holding a bottle of wine and smiling as if she had been invited. Hi, Jake, she said, her voice soft and sweet. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. I brought some wine. I thought we could catch up, just like old times. Jake's expression hardened, but he kept his voice calm. Claire, it's late, and we're in the middle of dinner. This isn't a good time. Claire's smile faltered for a moment, her eyes flicking to me before returning to Jake. Oh, I didn't mean to intrude, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. I just miss our talks, you know. It would be nice to catch up. Jake shook his head, his voice firm. Claire, I've made it clear that I'm happy with my wife. This isn't appropriate. You need to stop. For a moment, Claire just stood there, her face unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, the bottle of wine still in her hand. Jake closed the door and let out a long breath, leaning against it as if he could block out the entire encounter. I'm sorry, he said, looking at me with a mixture of frustration and guilt. I didn't think she'd take it this far. It's not your fault, I said, though the unease in my stomach hadn't gone away. But I think we need to be careful. She doesn't seem to be handling this well. Jake nodded, his expression troubled. I'll make sure she knows not to come by again. But if she keeps pushing, we might need to take more serious steps. We hoped that would be the end of it, but deep down, I knew better. Claire wasn't just trying to reconnect, she was trying to force her way back into Jake's life. And I had a sinking feeling that she wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. As the days went by, my fears were confirmed. Claire's behavior became more erratic, more intrusive. She started showing up outside our house, claiming she was just in the neighborhood, asking if Jake wanted to grab coffee or go for a walk. Each time, Jake politely but firmly told her no, but Claire didn't seem to care. It was as if she couldn't, or wouldn't, take no for an answer. And then, One evening, everything changed. Jake and I were sitting on the couch, watching a movie, when his phone buzzed with a new message. He glanced at it, his face going pale as he read the screen. Without a word, he handed me the phone. The message was from Claire. It was short, but it sent chills down my spine. "I can't stop thinking about you. We need to talk. I'm coming over." My heart raced as I looked at Jake, fear and anger boiling inside me. "She's not coming over, Jake. We're calling the police." Jake nodded, already reaching for his phone. This has gone too far. As Jake dialed 911, I felt a surge of anxiety. Claire wasn't just being persistent, she was becoming unhinged. And I had no idea what she was capable of. When the police arrived, they took our statements and advised us to file a restraining order. They also recommended that we document everything, every message, every encounter, so that we had a record of Claire's escalating behavior. It wasn't the immediate solution I had hoped for, but it was a start. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just beginning a battle we hadn't asked for. Claire's obsession with Jake was far more dangerous than I had realized, and I was terrified of what she might do next. And as I drifted off to sleep, one thought kept running through my mind: we weren't safe anymore. The morning after Claire's unsettling message, Jake and I both woke up feeling a heavy sense of dread. The encounter had left us shaken, and the reality of what we were dealing with was starting to sink in. Claire wasn't just a nuisance or an ex who hadn't moved on. She was becoming a serious threat, and we needed to take action. After breakfast, we sat down at the kitchen table, our untouched cups of coffee growing cold as we discussed our next steps. The police had advised us to file a restraining order, but the process was daunting. We knew it was necessary, though, and the sooner we did it, the sooner we could regain some control over the situation. "I'll call the courthouse today and get the paperwork started," Jake said, his voice steady but tense. "We can't keep living like this." I nodded, feeling a pit of anxiety in my stomach. "We need to do this, Jake. She's not going to stop unless we make it clear that we won't tolerate this anymore." Jake reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We'll get through this, Emma. I promise. We'll do whatever it takes to keep us safe." That afternoon, Jake and I went to the courthouse to file the restraining order. The process was overwhelming, filling out forms, recounting every detail of Claire's behavior, and explaining to the clerk why we feared for our safety. As we went through the motions, the reality of our situation hit me harder than ever. This wasn't just a bad dream, it was our life now, and we had to fight to protect it. By the time we left the courthouse, the weight of what we were dealing with had drained us both. The restraining order would be processed and served to Claire, but it wasn't an immediate fix. We knew it would take time for the legal system to catch up, and in the meantime, we had to be vigilant. That evening, we double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows, installed a new security system, and even set up cameras around the perimeter of the house. It felt like we were fortifying a fortress, trying to protect ourselves from an enemy who knew too much about us. The fear was suffocating, and I found it hard to focus on anything other than the possibility that Claire could strike at any moment. Days passed, and for a brief time, things seemed to calm down. Claire didn't show up at our house, and the text messages stopped. We hoped that the restraining order had finally gotten through to her, that she had realized she couldn't continue this behavior without facing serious consequences. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. And then, just as we were beginning to relax, Jake received a call from the police that it was late in the afternoon, and I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard Jake's phone ring. He answered it in the living room, and after a few moments of silence, I heard his voice tighten with concern. "What do you mean she's outside our house?" Jake's voice was low, but I could hear the fear creeping in. "Okay, I'll stay inside. Please hurry." I dropped the knife I was using to chop vegetables and rushed into the living room. Jake was standing by the window, looking out through the curtains with a tense expression. "What's happening?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "Claire," Jake said, his voice grim. "She's outside our house right now. The police are on their way." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "How does she keep finding us?" "We've done everything we can to keep her away." "I don't know," Jake replied, his eyes still trained on the window. "But we can't let her scare us like this. The police will handle it." We waited in tense silence for what felt like an eternity until we finally saw the flashing lights of a police car pull up in front of our house. Jake stayed by the window, watching as the officers approached Claire, who was standing on the sidewalk, staring at our home. She didn't try to run or resist. She simply stood there, her expression calm and almost indifferent, as if she hadn't been stalking us for weeks. After a brief conversation with the officers, Claire was handcuffed and escorted to the police car. Jake and I watched as they drove away, taking her out of our sight and, we hoped, out of our lives. When the police returned to speak with us, they informed us that Claire had been arrested for violating the restraining order. They assured us that she would be held in custody and that they would do everything they could to keep us informed about her status. It was a small victory, but it didn't erase the fear that had taken root in our hearts. That night, Jake and I sat in the living room, the tension still thick in the air. The house felt too quiet, too empty, despite the fact that Claire was finally gone. "What happens now?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Do you think she'll be in jail for a while?" "I hope so," Jake replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "But I don't know. We need to be prepared for anything. We can't let our guard down." I nodded, but the idea of living in constant vigilance was overwhelming. "Jake, I don't know how much more of this I can take. I'm scared all the time, even when she's not here." Jake looked at me, his eyes filled with concern. "I know, Emma. I'm scared too. But we can't let her win. We've taken all the right steps, and now we have to trust that the system will keep her away." We tried to go to bed that night, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made me jump. The fear had become a constant companion, whispering in my ear that we weren't truly safe, that Claire was still out there, somewhere, waiting for her next move. Over the next few days, we tried to return to our normal routine, but the anxiety never really went away. Every time the phone rang, my heart would race, dreading that it might be another call from the police with bad news. We knew that Claire couldn't stay in custody forever and that there was a very real possibility she would be released. The thought of her being free again, able to track us down, was terrifying. That a week later, that fear became a reality. Jake received a call from our lawyer one morning, and the moment I saw the look on his face, I knew it wasn't good news. He ended the call quickly and turned to me, his expression grim. "Claire's been released on bail," he said, the words heavy with dread. "They've ordered her to stay away from us, but that doesn't mean she'll listen," I finished, my voice shaking. "Jake, what do we do now?" Jake's jaw tightened with determination. "We leave. We get out of town, out of state, if we have to. We can't stay here, not with the possibility that she could come after us again." The decision to leave was both heartbreaking and necessary. We had loved our home, our life here, but it was no longer a place of safety. The threat of Claire's obsession had tainted everything, turning what was once a sanctuary into a prison. We couldn't continue living in fear, constantly looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next attack. We needed a fresh start, somewhere far away where Claire couldn't reach us. Over the next few days, we packed up our lives. We didn't tell anyone where we were going, didn't leave any forwarding address. We changed our phone numbers, deleted our social media accounts, and made sure that no trace of our new location could be found. It felt like we were erasing ourselves, disappearing from the world to escape a nightmare that had come too close to destroying us. We loaded the last of our belongings into the moving truck. I took one final look at our house. It had been a place of joy and love, but now it was just a reminder of the fear we had lived with for too long. It was time to move on, to find peace somewhere else. The drive to our new home was long and filled with a tense silence. Jake and I both knew that this was the only option, but the reality of leaving everything behind was still sinking in. We were starting over, not because we wanted to, but because we had to. When we finally arrived at our new house, it felt strange, unfamiliar, and unsettling. It was smaller than our old home, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by trees. It was exactly the kind of place we needed, a place to heal and rebuild, but it didn't feel like home. Not yet. We spent the first few days unpacking, trying to settle in and make the house feel like ours. But the fear lingered, making it hard to relax. Every sound outside, every unfamiliar noise, made my heart race. I found myself constantly checking the locks, glancing out the windows, half expecting to see Claire standing outside. The trauma of the past few months had left deep scars, and it would take time to feel safe again. Jake and I talked about going to therapy, knowing that we needed help to process everything we had been through. The idea of sharing our story with a stranger was daunting, but we knew it was necessary if we wanted to truly move on. One evening, as we sat on the back porch, watching the sun set behind the trees, I felt a small sense of peace. The air was cool and still, the sky painted with soft shades of orange and pink. It was a beautiful moment, one that reminded me that there was still beauty in the world. Even after everything we had endured, we did the right thing, Jake said quietly, breaking the silence. Leaving, starting over, it was the only way, I nodded, leaning into his side. I know. It's going to take time, but we'll get there. We'll find peace again. Jake wrapped his arm around me, pulling me close. We will. Together, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was also filled with possibility. We had escaped Claire's clutches, and now we had the chance to build a new life, one free from fear. That night, as we lay in bed, I closed my eyes and let out a deep breath. The journey wasn't over, but we had taken the first step. We were moving forward, one day at a time, and for the first time in a long while, I believed that we could find our way back to peace. The first few weeks in our new home were like living in a strange dream. We were physically far from Claire, but mentally, she still loomed over us, her presence haunting every quiet moment. The new house was everything we had hoped for, secluded, peaceful, and surrounded by nature. It should have been a perfect sanctuary, but the fear we had brought with us made it difficult to fully embrace our fresh start. Jake and I tried our best to create a sense of normalcy. We spent our days unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and exploring the small town we now called home. The town was picturesque, with tree-lined streets, quaint shops, and friendly neighbors who welcomed us warmly. On the surface, everything was perfect, but beneath that veneer of calm, the anxiety still churned. At night, sleep was elusive. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, set my heart racing. Jake wasn't faring much better. His face was often tight with worry, and I could tell he was constantly on edge, just like me. The trauma of what we had endured with Claire had left deep scars, and we were struggling to heal. We had decided to start therapy, knowing that we couldn't tackle this alone. Our therapist, Dr. Lawson, was a kind woman with a calm demeanor that made it easier to open up. In our first few sessions, she encouraged us to talk about everything we had been through, the stalking, the fear, the feeling of being hunted in our own lives. It was painful to relive those moments, but it also felt like a necessary step toward healing. We're safe now, but it doesn't feel that way, I admitted during one session, my voice trembling with emotion. It's like she's still out there, waiting for us to let our guard down. Dr. Lawson nodded, her expression empathetic. It's completely normal to feel that way after what you've been through. Trauma can have a lasting impact, even after the immediate danger is gone. The key is to rebuild your sense of safety, one small step at a time. You need to reclaim your life from the fear. Jake squeezed my hand, his grip reassuring. We're trying, he said softly. But it's hard. Every time I see an unfamiliar car or hear a strange noise, I think it might be her. It will take time, Dr. Lawson replied. But you're doing the right thing by talking about it and taking steps to move forward. The fear won't disappear overnight, but it will fade as you begin to feel more in control of your environment and your life. As the weeks passed, Jake and I slowly started to settle into our new routine. We made a point of creating new, positive memories in our new town, things that weren't tied to the fear we had lived with for so long. We discovered a cozy little cafe where we became regulars, found a beautiful hiking trail that wound through the woods, and spent our weekends exploring the local farmers market. These small moments of joy began to chip away at the anxiety that had been our constant companion, but the fear wasn't gone. It still lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. There were nights when I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that Claire had somehow found us, that she was outside the house, waiting. I'd lie in bed, listening for any sign of danger, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Jake was always there to hold me, to remind me that we were safe, but it was hard to fully believe it. One evening, after a particularly difficult therapy session, Jake and I sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and earth. It should have been a peaceful moment, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. "We can't keep living like this," Jake said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "We need to find a way to move on, to let go of the fear." I nodded, though I wasn't sure how to do that. "I know. But how? It feels like she's still with us, even though she's not." Jake was silent for a moment, staring out at the horizon. "Maybe we need to take a break," he suggested finally. "Get away from everything for a while. Maybe if we go somewhere new, we can start to leave the fear behind." "A vacation?" I asked, the idea sounding both appealing and terrifying. "Where would we go?" "Somewhere far from here," Jake replied. "Somewhere we've always wanted to go, but never made time for. It doesn't have to be a long trip, just long enough to remind us what it feels like to live without fear." The idea began to take hold in my mind, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe a change of scenery was exactly what we needed, a chance to reconnect with each other, to rediscover the joy that had been overshadowed by months of anxiety. We decided to take a long weekend and drive to a coastal town we had always talked about visiting. It was a small, quiet place, known for its beautiful beaches and charming atmosphere. We booked a cottage by the sea, packed our bags, and set off with a sense of cautious optimism. The drive to the coast was therapeutic in itself. The further we got from our new home, the more the tension in my shoulders began to ease. The landscape gradually shifted from dense forests to rolling hills and, finally, to the sparkling blue of the ocean. It was as if we were leaving the fear behind with every mile. When we arrived at the cottage, I felt a wave of relief. It was a small, cozy place with whitewashed walls, a porch that overlooked the sea, and the sound of waves crashing in the distance. The air was salty and fresh, and as I took in our surroundings, I realized just how much I had needed this. We spent our days walking along the beach, collecting seashells, and watching the sunset from the porch. We talked about everything, our hopes, our fears, our dreams for the future, and for the first time in months, it felt like we were truly living in the moment. The ocean had a calming effect, washing away the residual anxiety that had clung to us for so long. One evening, as we sat on the porch with glasses of wine, Jake turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "I feel like I'm starting to remember what life was like before all of this," he said quietly. "Before Claire, before the fear. It's like we're getting a piece of ourselves back." I nodded, feeling the same. "Me too. It's like we're finally breathing again." We stayed at the cottage for a few more days, soaking in the peace and tranquility. It was a brief escape, but it was enough to remind us that there was life beyond the fear, that we could still find happiness and joy in the world. When we returned home, something had shifted inside me. The fear that had once dominated my every thought was still there, but it no longer held the same power. I felt more in control, more capable of facing whatever came next. And for the first time, I believed that we could truly move on from what had happened. A few weeks after we returned from the coast, Jake received a call from our lawyer with an update on Claire's case. I watched as he listened, his expression tense at first, then slowly relaxing into something like relief. When he hung up, he turned to me, a small smile on his face. "They've decided to hold her without bail," Jake said, the words bringing an overwhelming sense of relief. The evidence we provided, along with the testimony from other victims, was enough. Claire's going to face serious charges, and it looks like she won't be getting out anytime soon. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized was still there. Claire was finally going to be held accountable for what she had done. She wouldn't be able to hurt us, or anyone else, ever again. for the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope that we could finally move forward without the constant shadow of fear. The road to healing wasn't over, but we had taken a significant step in the right direction. That evening, as Jake and I sat on the porch, watching the stars come out, I felt a deep sense of peace. We had faced down a nightmare and come out the other side stronger and more resilient. The journey to get here had been long and difficult, but it had brought us closer together, and now, we were finally ready to build the life we had always dreamed of, one filled with love, happiness, and the peace that had once seemed so out of reach. We knew that healing would take time, but for the first time, I believed that we would get there. And as I leaned into Jake's embrace, I knew that whatever challenges came our way, we would face them together, stronger than ever before. With Claire finally behind bars and the weight of her presence lifted, Jake and I began to truly focus on the future, one that we could shape ourselves, free from the fear that had dominated our lives for so long. The news of her detention without bail brought us a sense of closure we desperately needed, but it also left us facing the daunting task of rebuilding our lives after so much turmoil. The first few days after the news were surreal. We no longer jumped at every sound, and the nights became easier. But while the immediate fear had diminished, the emotional scars remained. The trauma of what we'd been through wasn't something that would disappear overnight. It would take time and effort to heal. Jake and I continued our therapy sessions with Dr. Lawson, who guided us through the process of rebuilding our sense of safety and trust. One of the exercises she suggested was to reclaim our home, not just as a place of refuge but as a space that reflected who we were and where we wanted to go. It was an idea that resonated with us, and we embraced it fully. We spent the next few weeks transforming our house into a true sanctuary. We painted the walls in warm, calming colors, replaced the old furniture with pieces that made us feel comfortable and at peace, and filled the rooms with things that brought us joy: artwork, plants, books, and photographs from happier times. The act of creating a home together became a healing process in itself, a way to reassert control over our lives and our space. The neighborhood, too, started to feel like a real community. Our neighbors were friendly and welcoming, and as we began to let our guard down, we found ourselves enjoying their company more and more. We started attending local events, farmers markets, small-town festivals, and even a charity bake-off. Each new experience was a reminder that we were part of something bigger, that life was happening all around us, and we were finally able to participate without fear. One evening, about a month after Claire's arrest, Jake and I decided to host a small gathering at our home. It was our way of celebrating the progress we had made and marking the beginning of a new chapter. We invited a few of our new friends and spent the day preparing a simple but delicious meal. The house was filled with the smells of cooking, the sound of laughter, and the warmth of good company. As the evening wore on and our guests left, Jake and I found ourselves alone on the porch, the night cool and quiet. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping wine and watching the stars twinkle overhead. It was a perfect moment, one that felt like the culmination of all the hard work we had put into healing and moving forward. "I think we've finally done it," Jake said, breaking the silence. His voice was filled with quiet satisfaction. "We've created a life that's ours again," I smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. "We really have. It hasn't been easy, but we're here. We've reclaimed our lives." Jake turned to me, his eyes soft with affection. "I'm proud of us, Emma. We didn't let the fear win. We took control, and we made something beautiful out of all the pain." "I'm proud of us too," I replied, leaning into his side. "And I'm excited for what comes next." The next day, Jake and I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. We were no longer just trying to survive, we were actively building the life we wanted. We continued our therapy, knowing that healing was a journey, not a destination, but we also started to dream again. We talked about future plans, traveling to places we'd always wanted to see, starting new hobbies, and maybe even expanding our family one day. One of the most significant changes was how we began to approach the world around us. Where there had once been fear and anxiety, there was now curiosity and hope. We found joy in the small things: an impromptu picnic in the park, a long hike in the mountains, or simply spending a lazy Sunday morning reading together. These moments, which had once felt impossible in the shadow of Claire's obsession, were now the foundation of our new life. A few months later, we received news that Claire had been convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The relief was immense, but it was also bittersweet. She had caused so much damage, not just to us, but to herself as well. Jake and I both felt a sense of closure, but also a deep sadness for the person Claire had become. As time went on, the trauma of the past began to fade into the background. It was still there, a part of our story, but it no longer defined us. We had taken our lives back, and we were living them fully, with love, laughter, and a deep appreciation for the peace we had fought so hard to achieve. One afternoon, as we were sitting in our garden, watching the flowers sway in the breeze, I found myself reflecting on everything we had been through. The fear, the uncertainty, the struggle, it had all led us to this moment, where we were finally free to enjoy the life we had built. Do you ever think about what we went through? I asked Jake, my voice thoughtful. Sometimes, he admitted, turning to look at me. But not as much as I used to. It feels like a different life, like something that happened to other people. I know what you mean, I said, smiling softly. I think we've done a good job of leaving it behind. Jake reached for my hand, his grip warm and reassuring. We have. And now, we get to focus on the future, on all the things we want to do, the places we want to see. We've earned that, Emma. I squeezed his hand, feeling a surge of love and gratitude. We really have. And I'm so glad we're doing it together. As we sat there, surrounded by the beauty of our garden and the warmth of the afternoon sun, I realized that we had come full circle. The fear that had once threatened to tear us apart had instead brought us closer together, forging a bond that was stronger than ever. We had faced the darkness and come out the other side, ready to embrace whatever the future held. Thank you for being a part of our journey. If you're going through something difficult, know that healing is possible. It takes time, patience, and a lot of support, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your stories, or any advice you might have. Let's continue to support each other as we move forward, one step at a time, into a brighter, more hopeful future.